Welcome to the TTS Talking Educators podcast. Each week, we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe, offering exclusive insights, inspiration, and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the primary and early years. Hello, my name is Mark Loveday, your host for this week's TTS Talking Educators podcast. I'm the headmaster of Frewin College, an independent co-educational day and boarding school for students aged 7 to 19, specialising in dyslexia and co-occurring specific learning difficulties. I'm a specialist teacher and specialist leader of education for SEND, and have taught across primary, secondary and sixth form in both mainstream and specialist settings, holding a variety of leadership roles. I've previously set up and led SEND advisory teaching services, been responsible for the creation of diagnostic pathways for dyslexia, dyscalculia and dyspraxia, and created and led an alternative provision for students experiencing emotional-based school avoidance, which went on to win Alternative Provision of the Year in 2023. I'm a board director for the Specific Learning Difficulties Assessment Standards Committee, SASC, a trustee of a multi-academy trust, and a national and international speaker. Throughout this series, we'll be discussing a range of topics aimed at supporting SEN in primary settings, inspiring you with guidance and resources to enhance your practice. I'm delighted to introduce Beccie Hawes as today's guest. Welcome to the podcast, Beccie. How are you?
Thinking that very well, all the better for being here, Mark. How are you?
I'm brilliant, Beccie, all the better for seeing you. So, before we get started, could you give me a quick introduction about yourself for our listeners?
Of course. I'm Beccie Hawes, and I'm the very proud CEO of CADMAS Inclusive. So we're a private trading service over in sunny Walsall in the West Midlands. We're a not-for-profit organisation, and we provide our schools with a SEND advisory service, a counselling service, a speech and language therapy service, 2 support dogs, who are my favourite employees, but don't tell the rest of the team. And we do Makaton and Team Teach training. And we're 5 years old now. We were literally, I know, where's that gone? We were literally born out of my frustration of seeing lots of our wonderful tiny humans needing help and not being able to get it as quickly or as accessibly as I would have liked. So out of my frustration, I decided to be the change I wanted to see and worked with the CADMAS schools to get that up and running. And here we are now.
Brilliant. And it's really lovely to see you. So thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us. In this episode, we're going to examine autism, try and unpick its presentation and also common misconceptions to help raise wider awareness and also understanding. So shall we start first of all with what is autism and how does it really kind of manifest itself in our little people?
I think that's a really good starting point. I often think that when we say the word autism, people have in their head it looks like this. But actually, it's presented in many, many different ways. So if I had 100 autistic children in a room, I'd have 100 different types of autism that completely varies on that day. And that leads me on to the National Autistic Society. Their definition of autism is that it's a lifelong developmental disability which affects how people communicate and interact with the world. Now, that's quite a nice, neat definition, but there is much to unpack underneath that definition, and especially around the word spectrum, which I think is really interesting with this.
Completely. I think it's important also at this point also to unpick those misconceptions around the terminology of Asperger's.
Yeah, definitely. So when we talk about autism, people sort of think of it as a spectrum condition, implying that it's linear and you're the least autistic over here and you're perhaps the most autistic over here. And we can sort of put people into those pigeonholes along the way. But actually it kind of doesn't work like that. For my sins, I have 4 children, one of which is autistic, and his way of putting it, I think, is really helpful. He thinks of it as a circle, and he says, I've got all of my sort of autistic skills and disabilities, rather than disabilities as he calls them, around that circle. And on some days, my sensory processing is terrible, and on other days, it's brilliant. On some days, I can't do any peopling, and on other days, I'm the life and soul of the party. And it really sort of varies. So he prefers people to say, actually, you know what? Alfie is autistic, and that varies on a day-to-day basis, just like it does for us. who are not autistic, we might wake up on a Monday and think, actually, you know what, I'm not singing it today, and this bit of me hurts, and I'm not doing that. So he talks about the fact that on his circle of disabilities, some of his needs dial up and some of them dial down according to how he's woken up on that day.
Completely. Well, that's a lovely way of describing it.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying about Asperger's fitting in there, people often assume that that's a high-functioning form of autism where children and young people are more sociable and adept in those situations. But actually, often it's those children that we make an assumption about, and we assume that they've got all of those skills when actually they're often learnt or taught or evident in masking, which is a huge aspect of autism, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point.
So thinking of feeding masking, and it was particular point as well, when we run kind of early identification manifestation, kind of the differences that we would start to see between our boys and our girls.
Yeah, I think we have a very interesting time as a service because we get a lot of wonderful young teenage girls that come through our service, particularly for some reason around year 8, the end of that, and year 9. And suddenly I think the best way I can describe it is their coping skills run out. I think girls are particularly good at looking at other girls and figuring out what the rules are and playing by the rules and not necessarily having that as a natural innate thing, which has got to be exhausting. So we have girls who day in, day out go through social rituals and routines and keep a lid on all of it, but underneath are like pedaling like mad like swans. And then we get to the end of year 8, we get into year 9, and these wonderful children just sort of go, help, I can't cope anymore. And then as one young lady said to me, my autism showed itself.
That is a really lovely way of saying it.
Yeah.
I would agree with you. I mean, when we had, my previous one, we were essentially supervision for EBSA, emotional-based school avoidance. It was all those anxieties, and our big population were our young ladies, those year 8, year 9s, as you've exactly said.
Yeah.
That volcano's bubbling away when it becomes more and more challenging with hormones kicking in, friendship groups changing, those teenage years starting, and not necessarily being able to just observe and fit in and mask as easily. And for us, we were finding that, and what you find in your service, but it was the fact that that was quickly leading to school avoidance.
Yes. Yeah, higher levels of anxiety, higher levels, and just imagine second guessing yourself all of the time. And I know there's a really interesting example my son gave when he talked about leading up to be brave enough to go and fetch himself a Chinese takeaway. And he phoned and he'd done it, and he got into the situation, and in the Chinese takeaway, they were running late. And he said, well, I don't know what to do now. He said, so I looked at everybody else in the room, and they were reading the magazines or the newspapers. He said, so I sat with a magazine like this, thinking that's like that. Okay, that's what we have to do. If you have to think that hard about every single social situation you're in, especially in a school where you've got a classroom full of other students, friendship groups, teachers' expectations, and that shifts lesson by lesson, life has got to be exhausting and tiring. And it is no wonder then our young people go pop in some format. And I'm always careful with that. We're not necessarily talking about the big, scary behaviours. It can be a quiet, I'm going to withdraw from this situation. And those students often get missed because life is just so hard and a little bit scary, perhaps.
It is. I think, that's where we'll definitely kick into that avoidance cycle.
Yes.
We look at the models of EBSA, and that kind of psychological avoidance cycle becomes really clear. And that pattern of behaviour develops if we're not getting in there and trying to get that early intervention right. And it's really interesting because we're talking about this kind of anxieties bubbling away, that kind of graceful swan. But
yeah.
Very similar to our kind of first podcast that we did with Dan Pickles as our guest, around, very similar, those young people with ADHD just trying desperately just to hold back together in the classroom, because often that's the kind of behaviour policies that might be within school. It would be really good if we kind of merged that a little bit and started just to talk about this, this autism / ADHD, the ADHD.
Right. I think there's a huge overlap, and I'm always mindful with our autistic students that come through our service of not just treating them as, in inverted commas, autistic, because actually we know that neurodivergence is a thing, and there are several co-occurring things within that. And sometimes by only seeing the autism, you only support that, when actually you need to think bigger and wider. And that's why I think the word autism or ADHD, it's useful as a starting point, but we have to get to know what that person's ADHD or autism looks like for them and begin by honouring that. So yes, the term is helpful, but for me, I always bring it back to what are the needs and what does that look like in its manifestation for this young person? And we start there.
Absolutely agree with you. And I think if we think about the kind of identification and then moving that forward in terms of diagnostic pathways, I mean, we know up and down the country, neurodevelopmental pathways are operating with significant waiting lists. What kind of advice would you have for parents who may be considering going down the route of a private diagnosis?
Thinking that for me, it's about understanding what are you going to achieve by getting this term for your child. And having been through the experience myself, I knew he had needs. He knew he had needs. And for me as a parent, it was literally, I asked him, do you want to find out what this is? I already knew, but felt it would be sort of helpful things to consent as far as possible. The interesting thing for me was exactly what I thought would happen was I went into the room with my child. I came out with exactly the same child with exactly the same needs with the word autism underneath it. Now, that has been helpful in terms of opening doors and avenues of support for my child and for many of the children I've worked with. But also, it can sometimes mean that he's been stereotyped. So at secondary school, it was very much, well, he'll like the Minecraft club. He'll like the war club. It didn't like any of those clubs, actually. He wants to be out on the field rolling around in the mud, playing football with his friends, thank you. And all of it comes from a really good place, but it's not necessarily helpful. So I think if you think it's going to help you and your family to understand it, to promote acceptance, to help you to unpick the needs and get support that you feel is important, then that's good. But always bring it back to, okay, my child's version of autism looks like this. This is what they need to help them.
Absolutely. And I think also to build on that, if you were going down the route of that kind of private diagnosis, it's just making sure that the route that you're going is reputable, it's kind of meeting the diagnostic criteria. You've got the professionals that you need to have involved, so it's not a single professional making that judgment.
Absolutely. I think for best practice, I know my child was seen by a clinical psychologist, an educational psychologist, who was also seen by a speech and language therapist, and I invited school to be part of that process too, because it was very clear as we all started to talk and triangulate, my child presented very differently in every single one of these environments. And I think with my professional hats on, take my mum hats off, I always make sure that if I'm involved in this process in any way, I'm speaking to parents, to therapists, to the EP that's involved, their occupational therapists, to get the breadth of information, because children with autism can present so differently in so many different ways.
And kind of to finish off this kind of identification, misconception starting point on our first podcast together, what about the kind of the sensory side and the sensory sensitivities?
Yeah, so a lot of our children and young people, if you think about the fact that they maybe through their autism communicate and interact differently with the world, they're going to experience the world differently in terms of some things will be too loud, some things will be too quiet. Sometimes we need sensory feedback. And if you think about it, this morning in the car, I was tired, so I had the windows down, the coffee in my travel mug, and some really loud music, and performed wildly. Arrived at work wildly awake, and let's go for it. So actually, I've met my own sensory needs. I've regulated myself ready to be available for work. For our children and young people, particularly those with autism, they sometimes need a little bit more or a little bit less because their senses sometimes can be jumbled. Yeah. So it's about making sure that we look at those needs, And we don't have a menu of here's this fidget tool, that lighting setup, this weighted pad. We have a buffet of lots of choices of wonderful sensory experiences so they can seek or resist appropriately so that they're available for learning.
Completely. And it is that individual. And I think, that is a great place to really end this initial discussion after this podcast. I think to summarize, it really is about that whole across the spectrum, not just, autism, but across our neurodiverse spectrum of need. That very much that once you've met one individual, one individual, and it is about understanding that individual in order to be able to support them to be as successful as they possibly can be. So thank you for that, Beccie.
Pleasure.
I'd like to say a huge thank you to our guest, Beccie, for joining us and providing such valuable insights. You've been listening to the TTF's Talking Educators podcast with me, Mark Loveday, and Beccie Hawes. If you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your settings and links to relevant resources.